Welcome everyone. European climate and energy policy relies on a mix of different policy instruments. Those policy instruments are based on different mechanisms through which they aim to achieve change. When they draft and decide on policy, EU institutions dispose of a number of types of policy instruments from which they can choose to achieve their policy objectives. Some of the instruments are quite prescriptive, while others leave more flexibility to member states and other actors when implementing and complying with the policy. Let's now have a look at the different types of policy instruments. Not everyone differentiates the exact same number of policy instruments. Sometimes only 3 are differentiated, but I'll distinguish 5 to give a more comprehensive overview. First, there are hierarchical instruments that are also called regulatory instruments or command and control instruments. In this type of policy instrument, the government tells different actors what they must do and then controls whether or not they actually did it. If they have not complied, the regulator can impose a fine. Second, there are market-based instruments. They use price incentives and disincentives to trigger change. If certain products or practices are cheaper than others, actors are inclined to select those. Third, there are information instruments, which are characterized by the absence of a hierarchical relationship. They rather rely on the expectation that changes are triggered by the provision of information. For example, about the amount of energy that a certain product uses. Fourth, there are voluntary agreements that the government can conclude with different private actors, in which they voluntarily agree to certain changes. And fifth, in the EU in particular, but not alone, another type of policy instruments has been used. This is governing by targets that are set at the EU level and must be achieved by the member states and other actors. Those 5 types of policy instruments are ideal types. In real life, the different logics can be mixed in the same policy or across different policies. Let's now zoom into each of them in some more detail. Traditionally, EU environmental policy and a large part of climate policy was based on hierarchical instruments. The lawmaker imposes certain obligations, prohibitions, or restrictions, and those rules can be enforced by the regulator or the courts. In the original EU treaties, the environment or climate change were not mentioned. For this reason, the first EU environmental laws were based on the internal market provision in the treaty. Those laws aim to harmonize product standards in the EU so that trade was not impeded. For this purpose, applying the same requirements to every product or process that circulate in the EU makes a lot of sense. Command and control instruments are very suitable for achieving such a level playing field and for harmonizing product standards. One example of a hierarchical climate policy is the effort sharing regulation. The EU level has specified concrete greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for each of the member states. And the member states must achieve those targets. If they don't, the European Commission can start an infringement procedure, which could lead to a fine. In the 1980s and 90s, and with political leaders such as Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, we witnessed an ideological shift towards the application of free market values to social, political, and environmental spheres. Market-based policy instruments aim to internalize negative externalities into polluters' decision-making. The target of these instruments are private actors who are influenced by price signals. The mechanism underlying market-based instruments is that policy makes it cheaper for actors to invest in low-carbon technologies and practices, while making high-carbon methods comparatively more expensive. Market-based instruments include punitive measures, such as taxes and fines, but also rewarding measures, such as funds and subsidies. The advantage of market-based instruments is their flexibility in terms of the solution and change that actors implement to solve the problem. The policies do not prescribe how the covered entity choose to comply. But of course, market-based instruments can also be problematic. For example, if the price incentive is not strong enough to incentivize the change. The most prominent example of a market-based climate policy in the European Union is the emissions trading system. The EU ETS sets a maximum limit for greenhouse gas emissions for large industrial installations and electricity utilities. Companies must submit allowances for their emissions every year. The allowance price has varied quite a bit over the history of the ETS, and therefore whether it has triggered sufficient investment in low-carbon technology is questioned by some. But the overall emission reduction has certainly been achieved. Information-based instruments aim to encourage individuals and organizations to get involved in achieving our climate goals through their purchasing decisions. The target of these instruments are consumers. By providing information about a product's or service's climate impact, consumers can take an informed decision and select the best performing products or services. Such low-carbon consumer behavior can provide an incentive to companies to produce better performing products. For example, energy performance labels inform the consumer about energy efficiency features that encourage the consumers to buy those products. I assume that you have already seen this label on household or other products. Voluntary agreements are not used very frequently, but they do exist. In the EU, such voluntary measures are generally concluded between the European Commission and certain groups of private actors. One example concerns car emissions. In 1998, the European Commission and the European Car Manufacturers Association concluded a voluntary agreement to achieve an average of 140 grams per kilometer of CO2 by 2008 for all passenger cars sold in the EU. This voluntary agreement, however, failed and was replaced by legislation. Targets can also serve the function of a policy instrument. They provide orientation for private and public actors and for society at large about the future policy directions. In the EU, targets are generally set by the European Commission and sometimes endorsed by the European Council and maybe even other EU institutions. The documents that the Commission adopts can be strategies, roadmaps, programs, or other types of documents. They have a signaling intention and also aim to build societal support. The European Green Deal communication is an example of this. It sets out an ambitious roadmap for the EU to become a climate-neutral region by 2050. Now, how and why do policymakers determine which of those policy instruments they should choose? This decision can actually be influenced by a range of different factors. the issue characteristics are very important. For a problem to which there is a clear solution, hierarchical instruments might be best suited, while for complex problems, the flexibility of a market-based instrument can be better. Effectiveness is about assessing how well the instrument will achieve the climate or energy goal. Efficiency weighs the economic costs against the expected economic, climate, and social benefits. Yet, quantifying the costs of climate change is very difficult and quite contested. To analyze those effects, the European Commission conducts impact assessments before it proposes a law. It can also be important to analyze how easy it will be to transpose the policy into member state law. How easy will it be to administer the respective policy instrument? Politics are, of course, very important. A policy instrument needs to have political support by a majority of member states, EU institutions, and the general public. In a union of 27 member states, flexibility can be important. Can the policy instrument be adapted to diverse member state contexts? And of course, compatibility with existing policy, institution, and cultures is very crucial. The European Union has a range of policy instruments at its disposal, although hierarchical instruments still prevail. But as I already mentioned, the policy instruments are ideal types. In many cases, an EU law or other kind of policy contains different elements and mechanisms. Sometimes they also are sequenced. A Commission strategy or targets can, for example, prepare the grounds for a hierarchical or a market-based instrument. Different policies that rely on one or a combination of policy instruments also interact, which leads to different policy mixes. The effectiveness of a policy instrument therefore depends on how it interacts with other policies.